I want to thank KPFA and the Pacifica Group for arranging this talk. It's an enormous pleasure for me, but I want also to be supportive to a source of news and analysis that this country desperately needs, probably now more than ever. So it's a source of pleasure for me to be helpful, even in the modest way that I can. So let me turn in the time that I have to do what I assume you came here to hear me do. A year ago, I did much the same thing in a building not very far from here, and I can see from your faces that some of you were at that event. So I thought the best way to begin tonight was to say what an amazingly different situation we face tonight than we faced 1 year ago a few blocks away. And I don't simply want to pay tribute. I want to drive home what I think has happened in the United States as a result of the past year and what it means for the year to come. For the last half a century in the United States, it was possible to debate a number of our basic institutions. We had debates over our education system. We had debates over our transportation system. We even had a debate a year and a half ago about our health delivery and health insurance systems. We were able to criticize existing arrangements, and we were able to debate them, and we were able to make changes. But for the last half century, we could not, as a nation, debate our economic system. It was a taboo. Republicans and Democrats, the vast majority of academics, journalists, vied with one another, not in criticizing the economic system, not in debating its strengths and weaknesses, but in being cheerleaders for that system. Capitalism could not be dealt with. We were able to criticize almost everything, but not that. If you did that, you were disloyal, you were evil, you were in the pay of a foreign power, you best shut up. Whatever else happened, the Occupy movement is the end of that taboo. Unlike the other movements, and we've had them, of course, over the last 50 years, unlike them, who shied away from being critical of capitalism, who often marginalized those in the ranks of movements for civil rights, for women's rights, for ecological change. In those movements, often those who wanted to bring forward the critique of capitalism found themselves in a minority, found themselves isolated, found themselves told very often that that issue would make it harder for the movement to move forward. And often there was truth to that. And so the question of capitalism, its role in these problems, its role as an obstacle in solving these problems, had to be put aside, had to be squelched, had to be denied. What struck me the most about the Occupy movement is that they did not do that, and they didn't do it from the beginning. Right from the beginning, 1%, 99%. Some in the positions of wealth and power, and the vast majority of us excluded. They didn't shy away, they didn't push it aside, they didn't silence those who wanted to say that loud and clear. The movement accepted that as definitional for what it was all about. That is a breakthrough we should encourage, we should nurture, and that we have, and particularly people like you and around KPFA, that is the right for us to be unspeakably proud. This country has turned a corner in debating its own economic foundations. It's long overdue. It's finally here, and we should celebrate what has been achieved in a few short months, even the President of the United States has to talk in terms of 1% and 99%, at least some. And in case the message wasn't clear, the Occupy movement, of which I'm proud to say I've been a bit of a part also, has also made it crystal clear that the issue is capitalism, not only the wealth and power disparity, but that we have a particular institution, a particular economic system, and it has a name, and we can utter the name, and we can utter the name critically. An adult society that can debate all of its other institutions wouldn't be healthy if it couldn't debate the economic institutions as well. If capitalism cannot survive the criticism of those of us who live in it, then its time may be over. And I shall return to that before I'm done tonight. So let me turn to this topic that we can now finally discuss. Capitalism. The system we have, the system we've had for a while. And I want to talk about it critically. First, this is a system that is fundamentally, and always has been, unstable. It has recurrent crises. They actually come every 4 to 7 years. And they have from the beginning. And they have in every country where capitalism has settled in as the economic system. Occasionally these crises are short-lived and shallow. At other times they last a long time. Let me remind you, the Great Depression, the last big one we had, hits in October of 1929 and is not over until 1941. That's a long time. 11, 12 years, depending on how you count. We're currently in year number 5 of this one. And in case you think these crises that last a long time are only ancient history, think about the second biggest capitalist country in the world over the last 40 years, Japan. It fell into a depression in 1989. It's still in it. It hasn't gotten out. 20 years plus. These downturns are staggering. They last and can last a long time. This one's in the 5th year and it's already compared properly to the Great Depression. Let's be sure we have some idea, and I don't have the time, so I can't give you all of the ramifications and the social costs of this crisis. But I have to mention some of them, partly because they don't fall into the normal what you hear, and so they may shake you a little bit to see all of the ramifications. Before this crisis hit, the American military had a serious problem of recruiting people to fight in the wars that are not only unpopular and expensive, but we couldn't get the people to do it. The military doesn't have that problem anymore. We solved that problem the way so many other countries have when they face a crisis. We let the economic downturn function as the recruiter of last resort. The military have more people than they need, and they have them because people have no other option. They can't get work, they can't get a life, and they join the army. Meaning that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the one apparently being planned in Iran, are not only the fiscal disasters, the moral disasters, the destructive whirlwinds we know them to be, but they're increasingly fought by the poorest, most unemployed people in this society, whom we get as a nation to do that work, and to lose either their physical well-being, their mental well-being, or both. What an amazing way of carrying out our policies. Second example you might have not understood. In the last 15 or 20 years, our neighbor to the south, has faced a fundamental economic crisis all its own. With NAFTA, with the movement of American industries into Mexico in large numbers, particularly industries like retail, Walmart, and so on, millions of Mexicans lost their way to work, lost their job, and any chance of getting a job, putting that country, already poor, into an impossible situation. It confronted millions of its people fundamentally with the following choice. You either leave Mexico or you're going to die here soon. And as you might have noticed, they made the choice you might have made. They came here. Where else are they going to go? And that temporarily solved Mexico's problem. It exported the unemployed and unemployable. Better, those people who left and came to the United States sent back money, huge amounts of money, to their families back in Mexico. The Mexican government, fundamentally dysfunctional, thereby was relieved of its two biggest problems. Too many people, no money. They got rid of the people and they earned the money. Starting in 2007, that all stopped. The people stopped leaving Mexico and started leaving here to go back to Mexico because they had no work. And the money that they used to send back, they were no longer earning. So Mexico got the worst of both. The people came home and the money stopped coming. Mexico is now a society that cannot function. The wars you read about between police and drug cartels, but it is extremely difficult to tell where one of these entities stops and the next one begins. A problem in many parts of the world, including our own. We now face a nation that cannot continue on our southern border. That, too, is a casualty of this crisis whose ramifications we're only beginning to feel. We're in the 5th year. The percentage of people unemployed for a long time is greater than in any recorded downturn so far in American history. When people are unemployed for many, many, many weeks, much longer than before, here's what happens. They run out of whatever savings they have. They therefore have to become burdens on their family, friends, neighbors. That widens the cost of unemployment. Unemployed for many, many weeks, you lose your skills. You lose your contacts. You become unemployable. That's a long-term problem for you, for your family, for all those who depend on you. All that's continuing. The costs of that will ramify into the decades ahead of us. The damage done to those people, their sense of self-esteem, their friends, their neighbors, their children. Who can count? Nobody does. Because the cost count would be so enormous. And while the vast social costs of this unemployment ramify, what do we see our governments doing? 50 state governments, every one of them doing what I can see here your governor is also doing. As the people need more and more help to get through this long, difficult crisis, every social program is cut. What kind of an economic and political system is so organized that when its crises put huge numbers of people in extra need, it manages to cut back the public services for them? That's not a system that's efficient. That's a system which, at best, is a bad joke. What is the defense for capitalism under these circumstances? Let me turn from the more rigid economic questions to the political question. As I tried to explain last year, and I don't want to go over it again, and indeed several of you cautioned me before I came in here tonight not to say what I said last year. It would be awful to pay for a ticket twice. I will try to honor that request. But just so we're all on the same page, I did stress, and as some of you read my work, seen the video and so on, know that from roughly the 1970s to 2007, something very remarkable happened in the United States. The real wage, the amount of money an average American worker got, adjusted for the prices he or she had to pay, the real bundle of goods you got for working per hour, never changed. It was flat for 30 years. The real wage in the United States today is about what it was in 1978. That had never before happened in American history. We are a nation that had rising wages for 150 years before the 1970s. That's why we live in a country that believes if you work real hard, you'll do well. A mistake people don't make in other countries. They don't have that history. We had that history. All the millions of immigrants who came here to have a better life made a tough decision, took a big step, but were rewarded by a rising standard of living. Since the 1970s, all over. Stop. No more. As a nation, we couldn't face what had happened. We couldn't face that the wages weren't going up anymore, that employers had no need to pay higher wages the way they used to, and therefore weren't going to do it. We didn't face it as a nation. So each individual handled it by himself or herself. By doing more work, we became the most workaholic nation on earth. And by borrowing more money than any working class had ever borrowed before, leading us to a level of absurd debt. You do not need a PhD in economics. I mean, I have one, but you don't need it. In order to understand that if the wages are flat, but the people keep borrowing more and more money, a day is going to come when the wage, which is what you have to repay the loan, isn't enough to do it anymore. That's what happened in 2007. And the reason this crisis doesn't go away is that condition hasn't changed. The wages have not gone up. The debts are about where they were. We're at an impasse. And I also stressed last time that for 30 years when the wages were flat, this other thing that economists measure, productivity, the amount of stuff per hour that a worker produces, that's all that productivity is, that kept going up. Workers had computers to work with, workers were better educated, workers had more machines, and all of that. So for 30 years, what the employer gave the worker was flat. That's what flat wages, stagnant real wages means. But what workers gave to their employer kept going up. That's what rising productivity means. Again, no need for the PhD. If what the employer gives you is flat, and what you give the employer is going up, then life may be getting harder for you, but for the employer, it's as close to nirvana as they ever get. And they knew it. And so for 30 years, the gap between rich and poor in America got bigger and bigger. No mystery at all. If the employers keep getting more per hour from you and don't pay you any more, your situation goes nowhere. And their situation keeps getting better. Oh, sure, as I told you last year, they don't see it this way. But of course not. They wouldn't want to think that their wealth is premised on screwing you. So instead, they developed alternative theories. You remember the theory of the genius entrepreneur. Lee Iacocca. Jack Welch. Oh, the names bring thrills to all of us. These leading entrepreneurs explain to us in books co-written by other people since they can't write. They explain to us that it was their managerial brilliance that generated the rising income of corporations. To believe that, you would have to believe that since those profits weren't rising in the 10 years earlier, they had been entrepreneurial idiots. They didn't want you to draw that inference. What they wanted you to understand was, since the rising profitability of corporations was due to their managerial genius, it was warranted to pay stupefying salaries, which we've been doing for 30 years under this absurd idea. But you know, here's the important part. If a society is splitting into the, now we can say it, 99% not in on this game versus the 1% who sit at the top and gather wealth, then we would have to assume those at the top are monumentally stupid not to deal with the one threat they still face. They've got the economy under control. They've got to make sure that the political system doesn't bother them. Because after all, in politics, we all go and vote. And watching ourselves get screwed over 30 years might lead us to want to use the ballot box as a way to offset or correct what was happening on the job. So the rich did what any rich people have always done. They took the money they got by not raising our wages while we kept working harder and harder, and they bought the political system. All of it. Both parties, all the candidates, all the political structures, to make sure that it didn't deal with the economic disparities, acted like either they weren't there, or were nobody's fault, or were your fault. And that's why our political system strikes the occupiers amongst us as big a problem as the economic system. It is the same arrangement. How foolish would those at the top have been over the last 40 years not to have made sure to take care of the political problem? Well, let's see what they did to get the full measure of this. First, we have a stunning spectacle, which even the most kind amongst us must have noticed. Republicans and Democrats fall all over themselves to get the rich and the corporations to like them, to please them, to be their good friend, to understand their concerns. It is an amazing spectacle to watch. Majority of Americans polled say that the rich ought to pay more taxes, but they don't. Majority of Americans say that the war in Iraq and Afghanistan is something they don't believe in. The war's continued. The majority, I can go on and on, you know these things. Why is that? Because the majority don't matter. It's the money. The money controls the politics, and those at the top have made that pay. Let's see. Number one, the bailouts. What a remarkable spectacle. And here I am going to be the professional economist, if you permit. This was stunning. Starting in the last quarter of 2008, Republicans and Democrats, without a murmur between them, spent trillions with a T to bail out the banking system, to bail out major corporations, one after the other. Tens, 20, hundreds of billions. A month and a half ago, after 2.5 years of litigation, the Bloomberg News Service finally won a decision from the Supreme Court requiring the Federal Reserve to release the information of to whom it had given how much money in 2008, 2009, 2010. According to the Federal Reserve, $1.5 trillion. According to the calculations of Bloomberg News, not a very radical source, 7.7 trillion, and some estimates have it to the 20s and 30 trillion. All we know is that day after day, tens of billions of dollars were provided to every major bank in the United States and quite a few banks in Europe. Day after day, money at virtually no cost, in unlimited amounts, to banks that were bankrupt at the time, which is why they needed that money. That's wonderful. You have to control politics to get it. But not only did they get all that money, not only did they pay a lower interest rate than anybody else did at the time, but not a single requirement was made of them. They didn't have to account for it. They did not have to pay in the future when they were healthy again for it. The government got no oversight, rights about what they did. Here is a banking system that completely failed, driving all of our major banks into bankruptcy, and that's what they were, defunct institutions. They could not pay back the people they borrowed money from. They could not return the depositors' money that had been deposited with them. By all reasonable standards of economics that I ever heard, they were defunct. The government gave massive amounts of money to defunct entities. Did it require in return a share of the bank? No. Did it require that a banking authority would have to be established that would have real power over them? No. Did it suggest, heaven forbid, that a private banking system that performed so poorly had lost the right to exist and would now be replaced by a public banking system? Perish the thought. No Republican or Democrat that I'm aware of even seriously proposed it, with the possible exception of that Vermont senator who is so strange. But I don't want to spend the time on the bailouts other than to tell you stunning, huge amounts of money in 15-minute debates in the Congress. 15 minutes. Wow. Meanwhile, let's look at other things the government might have done. We've had count them, four programs under the Obama administration to help people suffering foreclosure or the threat of foreclosure being thrown out of their home. Every single program has helped a small fraction of those it was set up to help. The vast majority of people cannot get a break on their foreclosed homes. Somehow it's just a problem and government can't quite get its way to figure it out. Second example. We have serious unemployment. In case you hadn't heard. Millions of people. 2007 December, when this crisis is supposed to have started, we had, count them, roughly 7.5 million unemployed people. Today we have roughly 15 million. That's not good. What do you do about this? Well, we do know what was done in the 1930s when we had bad unemployment that lasted for years. 1934, I remind you, because this cannot be said too often. In 1934, Franklin Roosevelt goes on the radio and he says, if the private sector of America either cannot or will not hire the tens of millions of Americans who have no job, then there is no alternative present but to have the government hire them. And between 1934 and 1941, just so you all know, President Roosevelt created and filled 12 million jobs. And in today's population, it would be about double that. 25 million jobs. Wow. The interesting thing is not that we don't do that today. The interesting thing is that the people who run this society are so disinterested in that topic that they made sure neither the Republicans nor the Democrats even propose a federal hiring program. President Obama says exactly what President Bush said. We are going to rely on incentives to get the private sector to hire. Year after year, he says it, year after year, the private sector demonstrates to all of us the enormous vertical strength of its middle finger. not that long ago, who managed to do all of this? But that's not the best. Here's the political corruption at its greatest. And I don't mean corruption in the sense of somebody violating this or that law. That's small potatoes. The corruption I mean is the structural arrangement in which a political system has been used to reinforce and protect an economic system. Taxes. Americans' next to baseball most favorite topic. Taxes. Let me remind you again. How did Roosevelt pay for all those things he did in the 30s? Remember what he did, for all of you, history lesson, quickly. Social Security. We had no Social Security system. That was created in the depths of the Depression. The government decided in the depths of the Depression, when there is no money, we know that because now you don't even have such a terrible depression, and there's no money, which is why everything has to be cut back. Poor Governor Brown had to explain that to you the other day. In the depths of the Depression, much worse than we have now, when there was therefore much, much less money, we created this Social Security system. In the midst of the Depression, the president said to everybody who was 65 years of age or older, we're the government, we're not going to give you a pension forever, for as long as you live. I thought there was no money. But we gave you better, he said. Wait, more coming. He created the unemployment insurance system. Before that, if you were unemployed, tough. Go to church, beg. Roosevelt thought that wasn't appropriate, so he created the unemployment system, which was, like the Social Security system, very expensive. Why? Because we had a 25% unemployment rate at the time we created the unemployment compensation system. And on top of that, he filled 12 million jobs. Where did he get the money? That's all very expensive. And here's the major way he got the money, just so we all know. Since this is so hard to remember, listening to our political leaders who all forgot. Well, to be honest, they never learned it either. In the 1950s and 60s, corporations paid very high taxes on their profits. For every dollar the government got from an individual income tax, it got $1.50 from the corporation. What's the ratio today? For every dollar the government gets from the individual income tax, it gets 25 cents from the corporation tax. Do you understand? Over the last 50 years, the burden of taxes has been shifted from corporations to individuals. So on behalf of all of America's corporations, I want to say to everyone in this room, thank you. But we're not done. Among individuals, what was the top rate? What was the highest rate that the richest people had to pay? In 1950s and 60s, ready? 91%. Let me explain to you what that means. For every dollar over, say, whatever the cutoff was for the richest, say 75,000. It was in that neighborhood. For every dollar over 75,000 that you earned as a rich American man or woman in the 50s and 60s, you had to give Uncle Sam 91 cents. You got to keep 9. That was the tax law passed by Republican and Democratic presidents alike, and passed by Republican and Democratic Congresses alike. Ooh, what is it today? Top rate for the richest Americans today isn't 91%. It's 35%. So the taxes were shifted from corporations to individuals, and from the richest individuals to, ready, you. So on behalf of the richest individuals in America, let me be the first one to say to all of you, thank you again. How dearly kind of you. And you have the nerve to want what? You might imagine an aware American population would say, gee, let's just go back to the tax rates we used to have in America, not that long ago, on corporations and the rich. And that would solve a lot of the government's problems. But we don't. We don't discuss it. We don't think about it. It's just not there. We have a president who thinks it's a daring move to suggest that we do not extend the Bush tax cuts on those Americans now earning over $250,000 a year. For those of you that don't pay attention to the rates, if what Obama demands were actually happening, and you know he hasn't been able to get it through for a while, he tried, but if he got it through, the tax on the richest would go from 35% all the way up to 39%. That's what the Republicans blocked. You don't know which to be sadder about, that they blocked it, or that's all that the Democrats could push it. When that's the choice, when that's the choice, you know who controls the politics, who controls both parties. That the progressive one wants to move it from 35 to 39 in the midst of the worst crisis in 75 years. That's what they propose. The only thing to say about that is, oh my God. And then to follow it by realizing he couldn't even get that through. It was all theater. The last sign of who controls the politics. And this is the one I save for last because as an economist, this is so outrageous, I have to calm myself down so I can convey it properly. Here's how this one works. A crisis happens because banks created wild financial instruments that had no foundation and collapsed. Banks lent money to people who couldn't pay it back. And by the way, the Republicans enjoy blaming the people who borrow. They shouldn't have borrowed. Hello, when you teach students in every college in America about money and banking, you teach what a bank is a financial intermediary. That's the language we use. And the job of the bank is to allocate credit. Pardon the stilted language, but as you know, economists, like lawyers, have to use simple ideas and hype them into a language so convoluted that you will pay us to translate it back. So banks have the function of allocating credit. The job of the bank is to determine that the credit worthiness of the borrower is such that the borrower can pay the interest and repay the loan. It's the job of the bank to do that. And what the banks did is do it so badly that we're 5 years into a crisis. This might, in a rational society, be a sign that private banking stinks. But fortunately, such ideas, until Occupy, have not been allowed. But now we can say them, and I enjoy them. The banks failed. And so we had a crisis in this country, a serious one. And the government rushed in and spent huge amounts of money to bail out the likes of GM, Capitalism, Tractor, Chrysler, and many others. And the Federal Reserve came in and spent huge amounts of money. No question there. Spend. Where did the government get the money to do all this? Well, it's real simple. There's 3 ways for the government to get money. Number 1, they can tax everybody. But if you think the bailouts were unpopular the way we did them, try to imagine the bailout if Bush or Obama had to go on television and announce to each of us that there'll be an extra 10 grand we'll pay in taxes this year in order to pay for the bailout of those banks. Then you wouldn't have Occupy on the scale we did now. You'd have Occupy such that we would not be talking about what may happen. We'd be talking about the Second American Revolution. So the government didn't do that. The government didn't raise taxes. In fact, our crazy government, they're busy trying to figure out how to lower taxes. So they couldn't get the money with taxes. The second way to get the money is to print it. They're doing that. That's part of how this has been done. They print it.
But you got to be careful with that because that can run away with you. So the big one they use, keep this in mind now, is to borrow. Every major capitalist country to cope with the crisis, Greece, France, Germany, Britain, Ireland, America, Canada, you name it. This is the basic way they all coped with the crisis of capitalism. The governments borrowed vast sums of money. Now here comes a thrilling thought that you need a PhD in economics for. If the governments had to borrow a lot to bail out the capitalists, but they didn't raise the taxes, it means they had to run a deficit. A deficit is when you spend more money, but you don't raise any more. Every government had to run big deficits, spend lots of money that they had to borrow. So when the dust clears in 2010 and 11, guess what? Every government in the world has bigger debts. There's no surprise here. They did that to cope with the crisis. But the brilliant thing, and you really have to take your hat off, I don't see anyone who has one, but if you had a hat, you would take it off at this moment, because then watch what happens. Governments, having gone into debt because they borrowed to bail out the banks and corporations, announce to the people that since the government is in debt and hasn't got the money it used to, you're not going to have a place to send your kid to school. We're going to cut. We're going to cut. We're going to lay off public employees. We're going to cut back because the government is dead. What? The austerity imposed on the masses is the consequence of the deficit that arose to bail out the tiny, rigid. Now you know who controls a government that works that way. And if you haven't figured it out by now, nothing more that I say has any chance of reaching it. A system that works like this. This is capitalism. It creates vast crises that last for years. It destroys the lives of millions of people. It costs the society unspoken amounts of money. It is now imposing austerity. That's what they call it in Europe. It's kind of an honest term. Here we call it fiscal prudence.
What? Fiscal prudence.
Sounds like something you have to drink when you're not feeling well. But that's what we have. That's not a system that's working to inspire loyalty. It's not a system that's working efficiently. It's not a system that's working fairly. It's a system that's not working. We now have in the United States, by the estimate of the United States government, something between 20 and 25 million people without work, or without the kind of work they want. For example, in a part-time job and they want a full-time job, and so on. According to the same United States government, 1/4 of our industrial capacity to produce is sitting idle. That's factory space that nobody's using. That's a machine that's just sitting there. It's called the capacity utilization rate in the government. It's about 70-75%. So a good quarter of our capacity just sitting there, gathering rust and dust. Let's see now. 20 to 25 million people who want to work. All the equipment, tools, space, and raw materials for them to work with and on, sitting there. This is an economic system that cannot put together the people who want to work by the millions, with the stuff sitting there deteriorating because it's not being used. And if you could put them together, the wealth output to transform the lives of all of our people. That's an economic system whose time is over. All right, now for the final part of what I have to to be done? And one of the people who loved his novels came a little later and was a political activist to ask the same question in a famous document he wrote. But I won't mention that because we're not that far yet in the United States. Well, I can see that many of you have figured it out. So what is to be done? Let me begin this part, this final part, by urging you to think about what ought not to be done. First, we ought not to revisit the question of regulation, whether it be the Dodd-Frank kind of law that was passed, or any of the others. Here's what happened with regulation last time, from which the lesson is, don't do this again. In the 1930s, in the depths of the Great Depression, the last big crisis, we regulated, we got into it. Oh boy, did we regulate. For example, 1933, the Banking Act, otherwise known as the Glass-Steagall Act, after the name of the two legislators. That was a simple idea. It said, you banks really screwed up, because what happened this time is what happened then. Banks took in a lot of money from depositors, and then they lent it out on long-term investments that didn't work out because these genius bankers lent it to the wrong people who couldn't pay it back. So they had to tell their depositors, thank you very much for depositing your money with us. Have a very nice day. You'll never see the money again. Which freaked the depositors out. You know the history a little bit. So a bill was passed which said there have to be two different kinds of bank. One kind of bank takes deposits. It's not allowed to make risky long-term investments. Then there's another kind of bank, an investment bank, that borrows money and can lend over the long run. But we keep these two separate to keep the money of the depositors safe and secure. They passed that bill. Logical. As soon as that bill was passed, over the opposition of the banking community went to work to undo it. First, they figured out clever ways to evade the law. They did that for 20 years, very well. Then they got kind of confident, and they went in to amend the law. They got that. And they said, why are we fooling around? What we need is to get rid of the law. And led by Citibank, Chase Bank, let me be fair, Wells Fargo, all the ones you know, they worked real hard and they, how shall I put it politely, persuaded their political hacks to get rid of this bill. And in 1999, President Clinton signed the bill repealing the Glass-Steagall Act. 8 years later, our banking system collapsed. Lesson. If you regulate, all you're doing is giving a goal to the people who run the enterprises of this country. You're giving them a clear target for what it is they're going to do. And guess what? They do it. Second example. Those tax rates I told you about, the high taxes on corporations and the high taxes on the rich that are now low taxes, and in many cases, no taxes at all. That's because the same companies used their wealth over the last 30 years to get the tax rates down. And they succeeded at that. What's the lesson here? If all you do is regulate, if all you do is tax, if all you do is make these changes, but you do not do something about the organization of production, who are the people who gather into their hands the wealth produced in this society? Who are the people who then can decide how to use them? What the reformers in the Great Depression did, achieve Social Security, achieve the federal hiring court, achieve the Glass-Steagall Act regulations. What they never dared do, including the socialists and the communists among them, they never demanded the end of the organization of enterprises in this country, such that the shareholders and the board
corporation, the regulations are a limit, an obstacle, a problem. It means we can't be as profitable as we otherwise might because this regulation stands in the way, or that tax has to be paid. We don't want that. Our job as a board of directors, our job as major shareholders, is to make this company more profitable. We therefore need to get around or to get rid of this regulation, this high tax rate. And the fact that they have this incentive, that would only be half the story. But we not only left them with the incentive, but we left them in the position to gather into their hands the profits of society, the discretionary wealth, which gave them the resources to realize the incentive they had, which is why the New Deal was undone within years of being passed. The first time this happens, we can say shame on them for undoing something that millions of people struggled to achieve. But if we do it again, it's not shame on them, it's shame on us. We didn't learn. We're going to do it again? We're going to raise the taxes on them again? We're going to put regulations on them again? Are we naive? Here's one of the great spectacles that historians in the future will look back on. During the months leading up to the Dodd-Frank bill being passed in Congress that levies at least some minimal regulations on the banking industry, the banking industry used tens of millions of dollars to lobby to make those controls minimal. That's not the best part. The money they used to lobby the government was the money that the government had given to them to bail them out. At this time, you either play the national anthem and bow your head, or you realize that this is not a system that's working, or better and more honestly, it's not working for us, but it is working for somebody else. Hence, what we have to learn, what the Occupy movement has to learn, is it has to learn two things from the Great Depression and the lessons of the Great Depression. Number one, what was it that got President Roosevelt in the 1930s to create Social Security, unemployment insurance, and 12 million jobs? It wasn't that Mr. Roosevelt suddenly had a change of heart. He may have, but that just won't do as an explanation. Nice guy, but, not like him. We do know. In the 1930s, we had the most widespread, powerful trade union organizing movement in the history of the United States. We've never had a union movement like that before, and we've never had one since. In a matter of 2 to 3 years, tens of millions of Americans who had never been in a trade union joined one. They put enormous pressure on Franklin Roosevelt. We had multiple, strong, large socialist parties and a powerful communist party with many overlaps with the trade union. They went to Mr. Roosevelt and they said, you better do something for the mass of suffering in this country, or else, ... And Mr. Roosevelt, who was a good politician, did what? He went to the corporations and the 1%, from which, after all, any Roosevelt comes. And he said to them, you got to give me the money to do all these things, to keep these people from tearing the place down. You got to give me the money for Social Security. You got to give me the money for unemployment. You got to give me the money to hire all these people. It's good for you anyway, but you got to give me the money. Because if you don't, you're going to have to deal with them and they're going to give you a much poorer deal than I'm offering. If you give me the money, I'll make sure they don't touch your control of the enterprise. He got enough of the rich and the corporations to go with him. He split them, basically, that he could push that program through. First lesson of Occupy, you've got to have mass organizations that will have the kind of membership and the kind of commitment and the kind of power that can make politicians who never thought about this
behave in ways that would frighten even their own mother. But you have to learn the second lesson, which is just as important. You can't stop short of the corporate organization itself. If you leave in place an organization of enterprises so that a handful of major shareholders control all of that, and they pick a board of directors, and let's remember that the major shareholders in the board of directors in every corporation are the ones who decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. Board of directors, typically 12, 15 people. Major shareholders, another 12 or 15 people, if that. They make the decisions that the mass of people who work in an enterprise have to live with, that the mass of the people in the communities that depend on those enterprises have to live with. If you don't change that, here's what we know. They will view the regulations, the taxes, whatever you do, as so many obstacles to be undone. They have the incentive to undo them, they have the resources, because you left them in their hands. If you do that again, we will all be sitting in this auditorium. Only now it won't be 30 or 40 years, because they've learned how to undo regulations and rules, and they'll be much quicker at it this time, even if we were strong enough to pass them. What am I saying? Well, in case you missed it, let me be real blunt. The capitalist organization of enterprises is the problem. It is this way. This way of organizing our enterprises, that a tiny group of people at the top make all the decisions and can, as we have seen them do, undo what the whole society puts together. They undid the taxes of the 50s and 60s. They undid the Glass-Steagall Act. They undid everything. They're in the process in Washington now of basically undoing the Social Security system as well. How much more evidence do you need? This system is not working. How could we deal with this? What could we do? And how do we get there? Well, my proposal is basically simple. We need to reorganize the enterprises of the United States so that we bring, if you allow me the phrase, finally, we bring democracy to the workplace. Here's what I mean. Very simple. That the people who have to live with the decisions made at and about the workplace be the ones who make them. That they are not to be dealt with in the way we used to allow kings to make the decisions for the political life of a society, or czars, or queens, or, the list. There was a time in human history when we thought we couldn't live in a society without one man, typically, being in a position to make all the decisions. We were all his subjects. And the world would fall apart if we didn't have this king. And then, through the action, which I am not endorsing, through the action of some people who separated these kings, the lower part from the upper part, we discovered that minus the king worked. One less mouth to feed. We could have a civilization without kings. We kind of pride ourselves in the United States for having been in the forefront of this kind of movement. Well, where did we get the strange idea that if democracy, rule of the people, accountability of the government, is a good idea in the community where we live, why wouldn't it be a good idea in the workplace? Think about it. 5 days a week, Monday to Friday,
the time you get up till the evening meal, you're at work. It's where you spend most of your adult life. If democracy is a good idea, it's got to be a good idea there. Why would you think that it's a good idea outside the workplace, but not inside? Inside, we should have a small group of people making all the decisions. And if you did believe that, poor dear, then everything I've just told you ought to persuade you otherwise. It hasn't worked out real well. We're in a crisis. We're suffering all this stuff that I haven't even had the time to go into. This is not a system that works well, at least not for most of us. Gee, how would it work? Real simple. Monday to Thursday, you come to work, you do your job. Friday, you come to work, you sit around with all the other workers, and you make the basic decisions, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profit. How hard is it? Let me tell you a little bit about it. And some of you are here from places like the Arizmendi folks and the others that have figured this out and have done it already. Not that there aren't problems with that way of organizing business. Of course there are. And those are problems that are difficult and have to be worked out. And here's another one. If the board of directors and the major shareholders are sitting in New York, Chicago, or LA, or San Francisco for that matter, but the factory and the warehouse and the office and the store are located someplace else, the decision to risk using a air cleaner or bad water or a polluting smokestack, if it's profitable, you do it. Because you don't live with the consequences. But suppose a decision on the technology to be used is made by the people right here who have to live with it, whose children have to breathe it, whose neighbors have to wash in it. Oh, guess what? Different decisions would be made. The evaluation of the extra profit against the costs that all those workers would have to undergo in terms of medical care and air filters and asthma medicine for the kids, all of that. All the evaluations, all the decisions would be different. What are we waiting for? This is a better way to organize. It's more consistent with democratic values, and it gives us a way to address real problems that mostly these days, if we recognize them at all, don't get much more than lots of conversation without a practical way forward. So here's a way to move it even quicker. I'm going to borrow in this proposal from the Italians who've already been doing what I'm about to describe for 25 years with great success. In Italy, if you're unemployed, the government gives you a choice. Either you can get unemployment insurance, weekly check, much as we do here in the United States for unemployed people. But you have a choice. You can choose instead to get 3 years, long time, 3 years worth of your weekly checks given to you in a lump sum right now. In order to get that, here's what you have to do. You have to get at least 8 or more other workers who are unemployed to make the same election you're making, to get the money up front. Second, you have to set up and run your own enterprise using that money as your start-up capital. So here's a thought for you, for the Occupy movement, for all Americans that listen to me. Here's what the Occupy movement might demand. A jobs program in the United States, immediately, funded by the federal government, with technical assistance by the federal government. That's what we had under Roosevelt. But with this new addition, based on all we've learned, this time, the government's job is to provide the capital and the technical assistance. But we're going to give the 20 to 25 million Americans 1/5 1/5 of the labor force in this country. A new kind of enterprise, one in which they will not only be the workers, they will be their own collective board of directors. For all Americans to see, for the first time in our country's history, what it's like to have a mass set of enterprises that run completely differently from those you are used to. Not top-down, old, capitalist enterprises run by an elite of boards of directors and major shareholders. Instead, by self-directed workers' enterprises. We're going to be able to see, not only will the unemployed see what that's like and work real hard to make those successful, because that's their lives, but it's going to show all the rest of us what that's like. Just think, Americans who claim to be interested in it will have for the first time freedom of choice. They'll be able to choose working in one kind of enterprise, the old top-down capitalist one, or this new one, a choice we've never really had, except for tiny groups so far in American history. Oh, my brain soars. I could imagine seeing shirts in the store that have a little tag inside that doesn't just say, made in Bangladesh, or made out of cotton, but it would have an additional notice, made by workers who are their own bosses. And maybe, between the benefits to the workers of that environment of their labor, and those of the rest of us who are consumers who want to support that option for ourselves and our children, we might see this part of the system soar. It would be a way of cashing in on what the Italians have already seen can work. And it would be a commitment to democracy at work and a solution far better, far more equal, and far more efficient than anything that either the Democrats or the Republicans have so far offered. In conclusion, I don't want to shirk from what I have said. We are now talking about moving beyond capitalism. We are now saying, or let me put it this way so nobody gets nervous, I am saying that an interesting slogan for the future might go like this: America can do better than capitalism. I don't want to end on a note that might strike anyone as unfair. That's purely rhetorical, what I just said. Capitalism delivered to the world some useful things. It was very dynamic in terms of technology. It introduced and developed all kinds of technology that we need and we want to keep and that we say thank you for. And it created a world market, a world economy. We're in closer touch with people around the world than probably any part of the human community has ever been. So there are things, even though capitalism was often bloody in the way it accomplished these, still is, but there are things capitalism achieved for which we say thank you. I mean that. But I want to remind you, slavery was a system that delivered cotton textiles to the world on a scale that might not have been accomplished otherwise. Slavery was the basis of a system in both Greece and Rome that developed concepts of law and modern developments of understanding and science, for which we are grateful and that which we have preserved. But that did not prevent us from saying that slavery is over. No more master slave. Thank you for what you accomplished, but the world can do better than that arrangement. We thank the feudal system. It brought us the European Renaissance and all of the
achievements, artistic, cultural, scientific, and we say thank you. But we don't want lords and serfs anymore. So we can say, with a clear conscience and a good spirit, thank you, capitalism. You did pretty well for quite a while. But we can no longer tolerate what it means to have one small group of people be the employers calling the shots, and the mass of the rest of us being employees. As a great thinker who thought about this a lot, and I've taught all of us a lot, even those of us who don't know, the modern worker could be called a wage slave. And the suggestion of that term is to make us aware that as we got rid of the second half of that term, it's long overdue that we go beyond the first term as well. We don't need to divide ourselves this way. It is producing dysfunction left and right. We have options. Democracy at work is a viable, practical, and effective alternative that promises much more in the way of what this society needs than any continuation of the present. And to watch as this country actually takes seriously the prospect of a presidency by a man whose major function in his adult life was to figure out how enterprises could make more money with less workers, to solve the problem of our society by worsening, in case you're wondering, Mr. Romney is what I'm talking about. We are at a strange moment in our lives. Never before has the failure of our existing system been more palpable. The incapacity of those who defend it to do it in an effective way because they really have no answer to this. The response to Occupy was not to engage its arguments. It was to repress it. That's a sign you have no other way of dealing with it. In the city where I live in New York, this failure was so abject that it took the following form. The people camped in Zuccotti Park near Wall Street had a free public library that they provided people books with. When the mayor of our city, a stalwart of the 1%, Mr. Bloomberg, ordered the bulldozers in, the city and the country were presented with an image. The 1% mayor initiating violence, because he forced the people out of the park physically, initiating violence against the members of the park by bulldozing the free library they had set up in the same month that he was closing and reducing the hours of the public libraries in New York. And worst of all, he couldn't come up with anything better when confronted by the press than saying he did it because he wanted the park to be cleaner. This is the mayor who presides and has throughout his 3 terms over the filthiest subway system on earth. Who did nothing to deal with that problem, and who was revealed in that moment to be the desperate 1%. They know, not that they would admit it, that something is underway in the United States for which they have no answer. Yeah. Repression is all they know, and that's the surest sign that with all difficulties that I do not mean to minimize, something has fundamentally altered in the direction of the United States. And you and I are lucky that we're here now and can do something to help it grow. Thank you very much.